Hi, and welcome to Fair Perspectives, the official podcast of the pro-human movement, brought to you by the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I'm your host, Melissa Chen, and my co-host, who you will hear from shortly, is Angel Eduardo. Today, we speak with Meg Smaker. Meg is an award-winning filmmaker, most recently having directed the Unredacted, formerly titled Jihad Rehab, her debut feature-length documentary, which premiered at this year's Sundance Film Festival to great reviews before becoming the subject of a cancellation campaign from a small group of activists. In this episode, we discuss how Sundance canceled her film, her background as a firefighter, and traveling around Afghanistan, how the 9/11 attacks prompted her to move to Yemen, learn Arabic, and study about Islam. We discuss her film and address the various criticisms levied against it, and the importance of compassion in art and in life. To support Meg and keep updated on when you can see the film, please visit jihadrehab.com. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you Meg Smaker.
Meg Smaker, welcome to Fair Perspectives.
Hi. Coming to you from the interwebs.
Yeah, great to see you with your brand new podcast, Mike.
Yeah.
So I think first of all, we should probably give a shout out to Nadia Gill, because she's the reason we know who you are. The reason that Fair and you got connected was Nadia reached out to me and said, "Hey, my friend is going through some stuff. I don't know what to do about it. Do you think maybe Fair could do something about it?" And that was, the beginning of our beautiful friendship here. So.
Yeah. Well, it's funny to even more of Nadia's credit. Like, I didn't even know her before all this started. Like, she was probably the only person to reach out during the peak of the kind of attacks and said, "Hey, I see a lot of my friends tweeting and posting very things about your film, but before I jump in, I want to see it myself." And I was very hesitant because I had just been dragged. And then I sent it to her, and to her credit, she watched it with an open mind, and then literally right afterwards tweeted, "This film would do way more good than harm." So, and then we just started talking about stuff and found out that we had a lot in common, and we're both very logical and rational thinkers and debaters. And I would just, like I was telling her the other day, I was like, if nothing else good comes out of this whole ordeal, the fact that we're now friends was silver lining on that. So it was really good to call her my friend now. So yeah, she's a fucking awesome human being. And she's also working on a really cool project now too. So I'm excited to see that as well.
I'm sure we'll get more involved with her as well, because Fair in the Arts is a thing we're all doing. But we've alluded to it now, and I'm sure that many people watching probably already know. But why don't you give us a quick synopsis of what the thing is that we're all here to talk about?
I think we're here to talk about my film. I hope we're here to talk about my film. My film called The Unredacted, which used to be called Jihad Rehab, premiered at Sundance this last year, and was received with rave reviews from film critics almost across the board. And then subsequently, there was a campaign to get the film essentially blacklisted, and it was really successful. And they did a really good job of that. And to give you guys another shout out, no one in the United States would play the film after that happened. It got pulled from all these different festivals, like South by Southwest and a festival in San Francisco and a few others. And it was I think I had to fly all the way to New Zealand to play the film. And then when Nadia hooked us up, you guys did something that was really helpful, where you sponsored a screening in LA and just invited a bunch of people. And from that screening, a lot of people who saw the film were really moved by it. And then that just started to spread the word of what this film was and what it wasn't. And then a lot of people, after seeing the film and reaching out to friends and talking about it, started talking to other journalists. And then, here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. On the front cover of the New York Times.
That's amazing. So glad that Mike Powell wrote that piece. And then I saw you on Morning Joe as well. So it's getting picked up. There's getting steam.
Yeah, no, that was really the thing that's really funny. I got yelled at by this the other day because I've been getting a lot of requests to go on different broadcasts and shows. And someone's like, you go on Morning Joe. I'm like, I'm not going on Morning Joe unless the actual host doing the interview watched the film. And it was like, they're really busy. They don't ever watch any films or books. It's just go on the show. I'm like, no, because a lot of the people attacking the film haven't seen the film. And if I go on that show and have this conversation with you who also haven't seen the film, I think it's a bit hypocritical. And so I was really glad that he actually watched it. And you can tell that he watched it because he had a really impactful reaction to it. And so it's just like, I was like, I won't talk to anyone who actually has not seen the film. So Angel, you've seen the film. So we're here.
Yeah, we both have.
You're in luck.
Well, so just to get into a bit more details of this film, because, I actually read about the brouhaha before seeing the film. And then when I connected with you and you sent me the link, I watched the film once. Actually, I've seen it now twice, but I watched it once first. And it's one of those things where what I read was nothing like what I saw. This film actually follows the lives of 4 detainees, specifically Yemeni detainees, who were transferred from Guantanamo to a facility in Saudi Arabia that is purported to rehabilitate terrorists. And it's so powerful because, firstly, you are no, shill for the War on Terror project. You criticize, it's quite clearly a critique on our terrible policies at Guantanamo, where we held people without charging them. And by midway of the film, I realized I'm rooting for these terrorists who allegedly have made bombs or fought for terror groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And it humanized them in a way that I was just rooting for them so hard to get back on their feet and reintegrate into society. And it's just so powerful in that sense. So, you watching this film, I really thought most of the critique would actually come from the right, because you've managed to humanize, the enemies of the United States. You've managed to humanize these terrorists, allegedly convicted terrorists, because they were never actually convicted. And so it's very interesting to me that the backlash you got, which we should talk about, actually comes from, the left in a way, because this is the art community, Sundance, and the people that tend to go to film festivals. So let's talk about that controversy. Why do you think what happened there? Why did this backlash come from that part of the
I was
spectrum?
Same camp as you. Like we were I remember before we would bring on anyone on the team, investors or executive producers, I always sat down with them. I said, before you sign on to this, just know that this is going to be an incredibly controversial film, and it's probably going to get attacked. And I want you to know that before you sign on to the team, because we're going to be all in this together, and it's going to probably be really harsh. And I kind of said it was going to predicted that it was going to be from the right. And I'm an ex-boxer, so I was like, I was looking for their right cross, and I didn't see the left hook coming. So I think that it was a shock because we had predicted that the film was going to be very controversial. We did kind of went above and beyond to try to vet it before it premiered. So we did around 30 test screenings before Sundance, give or take. And we did it with people from who were from the Muslim community, from the Yemeni community, Trump supporters, really conservative people. We had some Guantanamo guards who came and saw the film, and old, young, all these different demographics, super liberal, super conservative. And, we had these feedback sessions, but never in any of the feedback sessions was the film ever accused of being Islamophobic. And so that's something we weren't expecting. We were expecting some other criticisms that we were prepared for, but not that. And I think that it's just been really interesting, because as the controversy started and then moved, it kind of morphed into different things. Like the controversy or the attack started the day after the announcement, which is about a month and a half before anyone actually saw the film. So I remember the initial kind of accusations were that the film was propaganda for the Saudis and that it was funded by the Saudis. And then once you see the film, you realize that's not true. And then it was the film's Islamophobic, the filmmaker is racist, it's an all-white team. But then you learn that our executive producer is Muslim, co-producer is Muslim, assistant editor was Muslim. We worked with 2 Islamic scholars and an imam as consultants on the film. We also worked with like the premier in the world expert on jihad in Saudi Arabia. He was also a brilliant scholar, and he literally wrote the book called Jihad in Saudi Arabia. So he was also a consultant on the film. So we definitely did our due diligence. And then it was like a moving target. And then it was, the men didn't give permission. They were forced to do this. And then it came out that like, no, she talked to over 150 of these guys. Of that 150, only 30 were interested in doing the project. Of that 30, only around 12 were want to do the project without having their face blurred or any kind of like disguise. And for me, it was really imperative to have the audience see these guys' eyes, because that's how you kind of connect with other humans. And then we also had the top law firm vet the film and look at all the releases and basically say like we went above and beyond what you normally do to get this film vetted. And then it moved on to, this film puts these guys in danger. And, the film premiered in January. It's now October.
We should probably get into those specific criticisms in detail. But first, I wanted to back up a little bit and get into your background because it's fascinating. And it all kind of leads you to making this film. So I don't know where you want to start, but you used to be a firefighter.
You should probably prompt this because it's a long history. Yeah. We want to keep this short.
I guess let's start at firefighting because that's what actually takes you overseas eventually.
Yeah.
So how do you even get into that? How does one get into that?
How does one become a firefighter?
How do you get into that and what happens afterwards? Guide us through this story.
Yeah, I became a firefighter when I was 18, 19, I think, or somewhere in there. And I originally started as a seasonal firefighter and then I got hired on full time. And I loved it. Like firefighting is a great job. Every day is different. You get to work in a team. It's all about high stakes, fast paced problem solving, which I really, really love and I thrive in. And it was just a really great job. And if you asked me back then, what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, without hesitation, I would have said, I'm going to be a firefighter till the day I fucking die. This is awesome.
Wow.
And then 9/11 happened. And that was a really kind of quintessential moment for me in my life trajectory, because before 9/11, I would basically describe my firehouse as a place of like love and support and family. And after 9/11, there was a lot of like hatred, and understandably so, directed at the people and the region for what had happened in New York. And nothing I saw on mainstream media kind of answered any of the burning questions that was generated by that day. So a little bit around 6 months after 9/11, I decided to travel to Afghanistan on my own to try to find those answers for myself. And I know like that sounds, I was telling someone the story the other day and they're like, that sounds batshit crazy. I'm like, I know it does now, but it made perfect sense to me at the time. I think my dad, he always said there's like only 3 types of people in the world. Like those that when you hit them, they hit you right back. And those when you hit them, they run away. And those that when you hit them, they ask, why'd you hit me? And I've always kind of been in that third camp. And so right after 9/11, I started like watching a lot of news programs and reading a lot of books about Islam and trying to teach myself Arabic and reading about the history of the Middle East. And it was really interesting because one of the reasons I decided to go to Afghanistan, because what I was reading about Islam and about the history of the Middle East directly contradicted what I was seeing in mainstream media. And then I realized both of those sources of information were someone else's filter. And in order for me to like remove that filter, I needed to go there myself and kind of try to find those answers myself. And so that's what I did. And then after arriving in Afghanistan, I was immediately humbled by my own ignorance of the world. And what I mean by that is, I don't know if you remember what you were like when you were 20, 21, but I had a very assured view of the world.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, I do.
And it was really humbling because all those things that I had been kind of taught and internalized through watching the media and being exposed to certain kind of stories were completely kind of contradicted by my experience in the country. And then after that, it kind of set me on this journey to better educate myself. And I realized the best way to do that was to go to places and talk to people and try to see the world the way they did. So after that, I moved to Yemen to study Arabic and Islam, and I got a job as a firefighting instructor in Yemen, which was interesting, teaching Yemeni men how to fight fire while I studied Arabic. That's a Cliff Note version.
Yeah. Well, then where's the jump? How do you connect from that point to suddenly you're a filmmaker, firefighter to filmmaker?
Yeah, it was mostly because of my time in Yemen, living in a country and living in a community there and having people that I consider family there and to this day and friends, and having that experience and then seeing how the country was portrayed in the media and not seeing any of the stories that I was experiencing or hearing at all in the media. And so it kind of pushed me to try to fill that void and find stories that weren't being talked about, that showed things that I think would kind of challenge people's stereotypes about not only the region, but the people and try to, because I knew most people wouldn't go to Afghanistan or travel and live in Yemen. So I felt very lucky to be able to do that. And so that's kind of where I started to change and my career is like, maybe I want to be a storyteller, filmmaker, journalist. And and then I went back to the States and finished my degree and then went to Stanford and got a MFA in documentary filmmaking. And here we are with huge student loans.
Meg, so was it your time in Yemen that allowed you to develop the contacts that actually led to the making of this film? Because from what I understand, what you were able to do, which is to gain access to this facility in Saudi Arabia and to be able to convince actually in the end it was 4 or 5 men to come on camera and kind of reveal their soul is really it's kind of a feat. Like nobody else has been able to do something like that. What made you so different?
Well, I think I think it was a couple of things. So my time in Yemen was really helpful because I lived in a basically authoritarian regime for a half decade, and you learn how these kind of dictatorships operate, and you learn how to navigate it in the way that like you need to in order to get stuff done. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, most journalists go to the Ministry of Information to get their visa. Having lived in Yemen for so long and known that all ministries are not created equal, I knew that the ministry that I really needed to get permission from was the Ministry of Interior, which is like their version of the like Homeland Security, FBI, and CIA all rolled into one. And everyone was like, that's the most powerful ministry, and everyone was. Some people were really scared of that ministry as well. So, if I had their approval to be there, then that would have made it a lot easier to bring in equipment to film and things like that. And so that was like one step I did, but that took about a year. I mean, it took me a year of back channeling and building relationships and talking to people. And the one thing that you have to understand about places like Saudi Arabia is they never tell you no. They just throw hurdle after hurdle after hurdle after hurdle after hurdle in front of you until you eventually give up. And I remember like one time they sent us an email being like, we asked all the people at El Hayr, which is the prison you see in the film. We asked all the people at El Hayr and at the rehab center if they wanted to participate in your film, and they said no. So I'm sorry. And so that was supposed to be the end of it. I said, well, is there any way that I can go there and talk to them myself? And there was like kind of a back and forth. And I had spoke to some people that I had befriended in the Ministry of Interior. And finally, they acquiesced and said, we'll allow you to have physical access to the center and the prison with one big caveat. And this is the hurdle. where you're not allowed to film one frame of your, project unless these men agree to film with you from the jump. Meaning, like, I couldn't spend weeks there trying to gain their trust. It had to be like the first meeting we're there, they have to agree to this, because they knew that there was just no way that was going to happen. And then they could say, well, we opened our doors to you, but these men didn't want to participate. And they were right. Like the first time, the first group of people I met was a group of older Al-Qaeda guys. And I sat down, I started speaking to them in Arabic, and no one would even acknowledge my presence or look me in the eye. And then I went to a group of younger ISIS guys. Same thing happened. But then something very serendipitous happened during that time, where Saudi Arabia took their first batch of non-Saudi nationals to the program. And that batch just happened to be from Yemen. And because I learned Arabic in Yemen, I had a very Yemeni accent. And in the Middle East, Yemen is a very distinct dialect. So the way it's like very old school, like Shakespearean English, but very Bedouin, very country. So it's like speaking Shakespearean English with an Alabama accent. Like it's very distinct. And so it's not normal for a foreigner to speak with that dialect. Normally people learn Arabic in the Levant, in Syria, or also in Egypt. So when I started speaking, their heads popped up and they're like, well, why do you speak our mother tongue? And I told them I used to live in Yemen. They wanted to know where. I told them in the old city near the Sila. And then we just started talking about things, and we talked for a few hours. And then after that, I asked them if anyone wanted to speak to me one-on-one, and I wanted to hear like more about their individual stories, and a couple hands raised. And then word spread around the rehab center and through the people there that she wasn't like a normal journalist. She was like a white Yemeni. So that was what I heard. So after that, I was able to speak to a lot of guys, both at the rehab center and at the Al Hayr prison. And all in all, I talked to about 150 of them. Some of our talks lasted 10 minutes. Some of the talks lasted 10 hours. Like Khalid's interview, the guy who opens the film, the guy who was the bomb maker and bomb instructor of Al-Qaeda, his interview was 10 hours long because he was just such a fascinating character, and he had so much that he wanted to talk about in terms of his time in Afghanistan and his thoughts about America and his time in Guantanamo. So yeah, it was, I think it was a combination of having a very unique background and experience in the region, as well as, being pretty lucky that there were Yemenis that came in there. And on top of that, I think it was just like, I'm not a great speller. I'm horrible with directions, but I got tenacity for days. So it worked to my favor.
It certainly did. Now, one thing that I remember from watching the film, and I've seen it a couple of times as well, is we don't actually hear you very much at all. I think a little bit in the beginning because we're getting things set up, but I don't hear much of your voice, and I don't see you at all in the movie, if I remember right.
Yeah, you don't. There's one shot where I accidentally appear when Muhammad because I gave them a camera to film themselves in the pool when there's like a pool scene. And obviously they've been in Guantanamo for a while. And so digital cameras weren't a thing back then. And so I gave him the camera and he had it the wrong way around. So he's accidentally filming himself and me in the background. And then he's like, it's not working. So I'm like, turn it around. I was like, oh, there it is.
Right. Yeah. So
brief accidental shot. Yeah.
So there's no real substantive presence from you, and you're not, you don't narrate the film.
No. Who would want to hear my voice for an hour and 45 minutes? God, no.
Well, hopefully people who are watching or listening to this podcast. But
sorry.
Apart from that, but the thing is that one of the criticisms that I've heard of the film is, this thing of someone like Meg, for various reasons, should not be the person telling this story. And what's strange to me is that you're not really telling anyone anything. You're letting these men tell their own story. Now, of course, you are filming it. You are the director of this documentary. Yeah. So you are controlling it in a way. Mm-hmm. But I never got the impression, as I do with many documentaries, that the director is trying to manipulate me into seeing something a certain way. I didn't get that impression from this one. I honestly didn't, because I really just felt like I was hearing these 4 guys and then eventually 3 guys just talk about their experience. And it seemed as though they were speaking freely.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that was on purpose, because I feel like my experience with these men that their stories were so compelling and they were such compelling people that any kind of interference from me would kind of distract from that. And also, I'm wired in a way when someone's trying to tell me what to think, like a lot of documentaries, especially issue-based documentaries, are like, this is what you need to do. This is the cause you need to get behind. Go to www.savethebabies.com and click donate, right? So this was not that film. It was more of...
Not that you don't love babies.
I do. I don't want to get canceled again for not being a baby lover. Okay, babies are great. So yeah, I think that, like, for me, I like it when I'm presented a story or a piece of information and allowed to make up my own mind. Because I do think that the audiences, both in the States and other places that see it, are intelligent enough to watch this and kind of get out of it what they will. And what I like about the film is it's so open-ended that people have gotten a lot of different things out of it. So, for example, people in the vet community have surprisingly really responded positively to the film. And some people have emailed me saying it's been very healing for them to watch this film. And they relate to these men as, like, former people who they were fighting, but also shared a really interesting, similar experience of being in the war in Afghanistan and going through similar things. I had people surprisingly reach out from the undocumented community and really relate to these men in the latter half of the film of being in a stateless state, right? Being in a country that they're not from and they're not able to work and they don't have the proper paperwork to do that. And then we had, people reach out to us from the Midwest who were like, I had no idea, like, the people in Guantanamo were like this. And I just thought these were all, like, the worst of the worst. And they all were, these psychopaths. But I saw your film and they seem like, so one person said, like, it reminded me of my cousin. And he, like, really reminded me of him. And so I think that's one of the strengths of the film, is it kind of lets the audience just explore these stories on their own kind of volition and take from it what they will. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the film, is because it means different things to different people. And I find that a lot of the times when you try to tell a story in a way where you're trying to tell people what to think, the only people who actually watch that film are the people who I drank the Kool-Aid, which for me, I'm not really interested in that. I'm really interested in trying to, I didn't get into documentary film to save the world. I got into documentary film to, like, better understand it. And yeah.
But to Angel's point, I think one version of criticism that I did see was, when Meg asks the question, because you're not, like he said, you're not, like, in the film per se, but you are asking the questions. The detainees are facing the camera and answering them. And they claim, this is a criticism I read, that just asking the question, so are you a terrorist, is pleading.
I don't say, are you a terrorist? The direct quote is, do you think that you are a terrorist?
Yeah.
Do you think that you are? Yeah.
Right. Right. And so I recall, like, reading, I think it was in The Guardian, this, it was just a bashy piece. And it said, like, it quoted a film critic or something, or just a critic in general, saying, well, she assumes, or she's already painting it in our minds, that this person is a terrorist. And I'm like, no, it's not. That's not what it's doing. And in effect, after that whole segment, rolls, I come away feeling like the line of the boundary of what defines a terrorist is actually kind of blurred. One person's terrorist is not, another person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And so that criticism almost has no merit, at least from the perspective of the film viewer, unless there are people that feel otherwise. But I distinctly remember that.
Yeah, I think so. The reason why I asked him that question, and there's one right next to it too. So the two questions I think that people were calling out is, I ask him, do you think you are a terrorist? Like, I'm asking what he thinks of himself. And I also ask him, do you think you're a good person or a bad person? And the reason is, before that in the interview, he was talking about how people in America hate him, how everyone thinks he's a bad person, and how like he was worried about his kind of like what the world thought of him. And that's why I asked him, well, what do you think? Do you think you're a terrorist? Do you think you're a good person or a bad person? Because I was really interested, because he was very aware how, he was perceived by the rest of the world having been in Guantanamo. But I was wondering if he had both maybe internalized that or how he viewed himself. And I think it's interesting because I did have a vet reach out and sent me this email about those questions, because he watched the film and then went online and saw some of the criticism. He's like, you know what? I was asked that question many times from reporters, like, would you ever go back to war? Do you feel bad about what you did? And he's like, these are legitimate questions to ask people who are part of an organization, be it military or a terrorist organization that kill people. And so he's like, I got asked those same questions as a military person in the United States. He's like, so that's a legitimate question for you to ask. But I do think to the point of the like, you're an interrogator type thing. One thing I want to say, and I do this with all of, not just this film, but all my films, is I think part of the thing where you have to kind of get people to open up is give them agency. So before we ever started filming, I always told them, like, listen, I'm going to ask you some questions. And if some of these questions make you uncomfortable or you don't want to answer them or you feel like you have to lie, all you have to do is say, move on. I was like, this is a conversation. This is not like Guantanamo. And I put that in the film. So you see someone like Abu Ghanem being like, skip that question. And because, so what's really funny is, as a firefighter, we get a lot of training when it comes to dealing with traumatized people. Because usually when you go on a call, you're dealing with people at the most traumatic moment in their lives. And part of that training is having to give people more agency. And so with these guys in particular, it was imperative that they knew that they had the power to like stop the interview at any time, to, answer a question or not answer a question. And you see that in the film, and we were being very transparent about that. So like, for example, we see Abu Ghanem leave the project and, cause he had that agency to like, I've said all I needed to say. I don't want to talk about other stuff and I'm done now. So I think trying to incorporate that in the film and being transparent about how the film was made, I think people who, were tracking the film interpreted that in a bad faith way, which it wasn't done that way. So yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of agency, I think that's probably the most important criticism that I've seen is this idea. And I think, I'm pretty sure the Abigail Disney apology, she apologized for executive producing the film. For those of you who don't know, but she mentioned it in her apology, and other people have mentioned it. It's in this Guardian article that a lot of people have been sharing ever since FAIR has been posting things about your film. I think that's one of the most important criticisms is this idea that these men could not consent to being interviewed. They could not possibly do it under anything except coercion because of their circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that from the outside, if you've never been to Saudi Arabia and you've never met me and you weren't there for 3 years, you can make that assumption. But the Saudi government was like, no one wants to interview you, or have you interview them through the email. And I was like, can I just meet with them? And it was a long process to do that. And I did talk to 150 of them. So these guys weren't forced to do this. And then you see kind of some of their answers or some of their stories change over those 3 years. Like when Muhammad really starts out the film, he basically says, I was on vacation in Afghanistan. And then after he's in the program for a while, he's like, well, actually, I went there to fight. And I think you see that kind of evolution over the film. And I think if someone was forcing someone to say what they wanted them to say, they wouldn't start out a film claiming something else. And also, I think that it's really like I was there for 3 years, and a lot of the people criticizing that aspect of it have never stepped foot in the kingdom and have never been to the rehab center. And personally, I would never pretend to know how a film was made unless I was on that film team in country, or I had a really deep dive talk with the filmmaker. And I just feel that there's a lot of people who are just immediately assuming bad faith, and they haven't talked to me. They don't know how the film was made. They say these men are forced to do this, but neglecting the fact that we talked to over 100 of these men. So it just, I think what's been really interesting for me as a learning curve is I think the perception of the film has become more important than the actual like truth about the film. And that perception has been, and the framing has been very successfully put out there, and a lot of misinformation about it as well.
On that point, I do think that the criticism holds no water, especially if you consider how many journalists have to go into prisons to interview, I don't know, people who are incarcerated like Jeffrey Dahmer or Richard Ramirez, the serial killers. And people have produced documentaries.
One of the most famous documentaries of all time is Thin Blue Line, where Errol Morris went into a prison and he interviewed a man who was on death row. And because of that documentary and the man being able to tell his side of the story, he was then exonerated and put off death row. And so if we're going to say we're not allowed to interview anyone incarcerated, then sometimes that's the last chance they have to like challenge the stories that are told about them. And like, so for example, Ali in the film, they each wanted to participate in the film for different reasons. Ali was mostly like he was under the shadow of his brother, and his brother was the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and he was painted with that same brush, and he wanted to tell his own story and be his own individual and have people know that he wasn't his brother. And so if you're saying that he's not allowed to tell his own story, I think that's like you're basically doing what was done to them in Guantanamo for 15 years. You're basically silencing them. You're redacting them. They're redacting their side. And one of the reasons why we decided to change the name to Unredacted is because this film like lets them tell their own story and unredact that side of it. And also unredact the film since the film's been redacted as well, essentially. So I like double entendres, so that's why.
Yeah, that's good. But so I think a lot of misinformation is going around. People are responding, and it's hard to know whether people are being sincere or not. But taking them in good faith and taking them at their word, maybe reiterate all the steps you took to ensure that these men gave informed consent and were willful participants in this project. What were all the steps you took to ensure that?
There are things that I did specifically for these guys and there are things that I do with all subjects. So I'll talk about what I do with all my films. So anytime I do a documentary, I never meet the subject with a camera first time. I always meet them one-on-one without the camera. And I basically tell them this. You have to explain to them what a documentary is, because most people don't understand how it's made. And I didn't until I became a documentary filmmaker. So you have to explain, like, this is not a one-off interview. I'm going to be in your life for quite a long time, and we're going to have several conversations. I'm going to film you here and at your house, and I'm going to talk to your family and kind of give them the lay of the land about how a documentary is made. And then after that, I explain to them, like, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, and, I want you to feel comfortable answering them. And so because I'm going to ask you a lot of questions for this first time that we're talking, you can ask me anything you want. I mean, anything. You can ask me, like, my favorite color to like my first kiss, like anything is on the table, because I want you to feel comfortable with me. And if you don't feel comfortable with me and you don't trust me to tell your story, then I actually do not want you to do this for two reasons. Number one, it will show up on camera. And I don't want that. It's not going to look good in the film, and it's not going to come across as genuine and sincere and authentic. And number two, I had a documentary made about me that I wasn't really, I didn't really know the people who did it, and it wasn't a good experience for me. And so I would not wish that on anyone else. And I think because of that experience, I'm quite aware of what it is to have someone else tell your story, and giving them the chance and the agency to kind of ask me and grill me all those questions. Nader was like, why aren't you married? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, so those are some of the questions I got in the beginning. He's like, you're how old and you're not married? What does your father think about that? And so those are some pretty interesting questions in the beginning. Yeah. And I think that when you're talking about making a documentary, it isn't an interrogation. It is a conversation.
So yes, but let's get into the specific things you did for these men.
For these men, I did all that with these guys, but also you have to, like, normally for films, you have people sign these really long release forms that are written by lawyers, and they're really complicated, and they're like 2-3 pages long. And for me, knowing that I get really intimidated by when I see legal contracts, especially someone who was in Guantanamo for 15 years and people wanted them to constantly sign things and like confessions and stuff. It was imperative to me that we give them something that they could grasp and that was really simple. And so it was like a little paragraph in English, and then right next to it, a paragraph in Arabic. And it was just like a basic, like, I'm giving you permission to film me and use that in a documentary that's going to go everywhere and that kind of thing. So yeah. And so it was typically we do a much more thorough thing, but I think you have to kind of meet people where they're at. And for the professors at the rehab center, the ones that were educated in the West and were fluent in English, we gave them the normal ones. But so it was stuff like that. And then, yeah, like it was also like trying to be aware of where we're at, and both in editing the film and in the questions we asked. These men had just got back from, Guantanamo. And so originally a lot of the like conversations we had were very benign. It was giving them a chance to get comfortable with me. So we talk about their favorite soccer team and childhood memories and things like that. And then, the great thing about documentaries is you have the time and the space and the grace to kind of let those relationships evolve organically over time. And as we show in the film in the beginning, there's like, I'm suspicious of them, they're suspicious of me, they're kind of guarded. And as the film like goes on, they and I both open up to one another, and you see this kind of very, close relationship. And I like one of the scenes in the film, Ali says, I've never told anyone else this before, not even my own sister. And he talks about feeling shame for some of the things that he said in Guantanamo to the people there, and how he regrets that. And I think that you only get to that space with someone if you've spent a lot of time with them and they trust you. And yeah, does that make sense?
You mentioned earlier, you said that one of the things that strikes you about this whole controversy is that people are reacting to the perception of the film and not the film itself. And there are a few players in all of this. And one of them which I think is particularly insidious, is actually the role of journalists in pushing out this smear campaign. Article, actually, the hit piece that The Guardian wrote, there were a lot of quite blatant lies that if you watch the film would be directly challenged. And it strikes me. And the problem is that because the film is right now in no man's land, no one can actually watch it to determine for themselves and push back. And so that is a lot of power to this small group of activists, because they can say anything they want. And very little people who actually had the privilege. We had the privilege to see the film because of our association with FAIR and because we're interviewing you. But the rest of the world can't see it and can't push back on that narrative. And so we've just handed them all this power. And, complicit in all of this is, the Abigail Disneys of the world, the people that loved the film until they didn't. And not because anything changed other than there was just so much smoke surrounding it. And so they conclude that where there's smoke, there's fire. And this is really just a terrible storm of events.
Yeah. I think for me, it's been a learning curve, because with the exception of the New York Times piece and then a couple journalists that have reached out since then have been actual, like, I don't want to say proper journalists, but journalists who actually like do their due diligence. I know in the beginning, I was reached out by a lot of outlets that were like trade magazines, like IndieWire, and they just wanted a quote. They said, we have these 2-3 questions. We want answers to these. And based on those 2-3 questions, I realized that they'd already written a narrative and they just wanted a soundbite to fit that narrative. And for example, The Guardian. So there's a big difference between a staff writer and a freelance writer. So for example, Michael Powell is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who's on the staff of the New York Times. And there is a lot of due diligence that you have to do in order to publish a piece like that. Where the person who wrote The Guardian is this kind of freelance, kind of activist writer, journalist. And what I mean by that is when I originally heard from her, it was about 4 months after Sundance. So 4 months after Sundance, she wrote me an email and basically saying, I'm doing a story about how your film is offensive to the Muslim community. And I'd like to, get some like quotes or whatever from you, or like, get some information from you. And she wanted to know like where the film was going to screen next and its kind of publication plans. And then I wrote back, I'm like, have you seen the film? And if so, where? And she said she saw it at Sundance, which is strange because she's located in the UK and it was geo-blocked to only play in the United States. And so, okay, fair enough. Maybe she got around that. But then Sundance was 4 months ago. Why would you wait 4 months then to reach out to me? And so then I messaged or emailed her back. I'm like, well, what did you think of the film? And then I never heard back from her because during that time, the articles came out from Lorraine Ali, who's Muslim, from Zaid, who's Muslim, who came out and supported the film and really, really championed it. And so fast forward to July, she then emailed me again. This is like, I didn't hear from her for months. And then this new email, she said, I'm picking this back up. Now I'm writing a story about how your film puts these men in harm's way and they're in danger. And so what I realized from that interaction is this is not a real journalist. This is someone who's trying to find an angle on this film. Yeah. And so I told them, and she said, I want these 5-6 questions answered in writing. And so I wrote her back and I said, listen, I'm willing to give you an interview and I talk to you for however long you want about anything. But I want it to be on Zoom because I want to be able to talk to you face to face. And I want your editor to be on that call because it was clear to me that she was not what I would call a real journalist. Because a real journalist doesn't go into a conversation with accusations. They go in with curiosity. It's all about inquiry, where she was going like on an inquisition. It's a big difference. And so I offered that. And any journalist worth their salt would have jumped in an interview to be completely on the record and unlimited time. And they turned it down. And she said, no, you have to answer these 6 questions in writing by 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, or we're going to print this paragraph about you and, how you declined to talk and all this other stuff. And I just thought, wow, this is how The Guardian operates. Like, this was really alarming to me. And so we answered all the questions in writing because it felt like I didn't really have any choice. And then they didn't really include almost any of the stuff that we wrote because it kind of shut down all the stuff that they were accusing us of. And I think they just wrote like the filmmaker disputes this. And so that got published and it was full of like just lies. And because I'd had experience in the past early on this process with publications printing, things that were factually inaccurate and then reaching out and making them aware of that and saying, hey, just to let you know, like, so for example, Documentary Magazine had an article where we found like so many factual errors, but one of them was really egregious where the direct quote was, the men professed their innocence throughout the entire film. Now, if you watch the first 5 minutes of the film, that's not true. And so we pointed that out and they didn't change it. Or like, you either didn't watch the film and pretended that you did, or you watched the film and you're just lying about it. And in my opinion, that doesn't make you a journalist. And it also doesn't make your publication very reliable. So when The Guardian published it, I realized just writing them back would not solve the problem to get a retraction. So we reached out to some lawyers in the UK and said, hey, like, this is what happened. Here are all the factual errors. Here's the proof that why it's like wrong. And they're like, okay, yeah, we deal with the Guardian all the time. Step one is we're going to write a letter. And that letter is going to start this conversation and will eventually, because of obviously it is untrue, get it retracted and whatnot. And they said, but step one is the letter. I said, okay, well, how much does that cost? And just to write a letter was £5,000. Now, I don't know about you, but I have, since I got canceled, I have not really had much of an income at all. So I didn't have the resource to do that. And I realized that if you're very well off, you're able to combat these kind of things. But if you're a normal person, if you're just working class, you kind of had no recourse in these ways. And so all these lies and misinformation has spread because I don't have a war chest to be able to combat the misinformation. And that's been really frustrating because people look at The Guardian as a very reputable publication. And I do think there's probably staff writers that are very reputable. But this particular person definitely wasn't operating from a place of good space or inquiry or curiosity. And I think that is unfortunate because I think in the end, like, I don't really have a war chest, but I do have a really big stick, and that's called the truth. And I hope the truth eventually comes out. And I think it's probably not going to be a really good look for The Guardian when they do.
Yeah. Speaking of eventually coming out, we've been talking this whole time about how, if you see the film, you will see this. And so far, most people will not have had that chance. But I think that's changing.
I hope so.
Tell us what's happening and how people can stay informed about what's going on.
Well, so because we weren't able to get distribution, and it's very so that we had, like with a Netflix or whatnot or a Hulu, it still want the film to go out in the world, so we have to like self-distribute, which means we have to make the trailers for the film and posters for film and put it out in the world. And again, that's all costs a lot of money, and I don't come from money. So right now I'm doing a GoFundMe page where we're trying to raise money to pay for the trailer, to pay for posters, to pay for legal, to kind of sort all this stuff out, like contracts with theaters and things like that. And, just the old firefighter thing, improvise, adapt, and overcome. So we're trying to do it some way to get it out there. Because I do think for me, and I wish we could talk about the film more than the controversy, but the thing that I really love about the film is how impactful it's been. And I think the thing that's kept me going throughout all this and like kept me trying to fight to get this thing out there is people who have seen it, and their response to it has been so strong and powerful and impactful. And it, like, if you have, like, I went on Morning Joe the other day, and here's a guy who was a complete supporter of the war on terror. And then he watched the film and he was like, oh shit, like maybe my viewpoint was wrong. And that's a huge, huge like deal, especially in this day and age when everyone kind of digs in so hard on their beliefs and kind of doesn't go into films with, and we're all very politicized. And for me, this film kind of tries to stay away from that. And what I mean by that is, when I was in high school, I studied World War II, and you learn about all the facts and the battles and the numbers and 6 million people dying. And my little human brain could not wrap my head around that. Like, I can't understand 6 million people being killed. But then I read the book Anne Frank, and just that human story, just that individual, just one person story within that environment helped me kind of contextualize everything else. And for me, I'm hoping that this film can do the same thing for kind of the last 20 years of the war on terror, is put like a human story on the cost of war and the cost of conflict and what it means like on the ground in people's lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so is it jihadrehab.com? Is that where people can sign up for info and updates?
Yeah. So if you want to donate to the GoFundMe, you can go to jihadrehab.com and hit donate, and it will take you to the GoFundMe page, because I forgot a longer URL on the GoFundMe. I guess you can also go to GoFundMe and search for the Unredacted. That will probably help you find it too. And so, yeah, so we're trying to, like, I think criticism is part of the process, right? That's not what I have a problem with. I think that when you write a book or when you make a movie and you put it out in the public space, criticism is part of that process. And actually, like, sometimes it really makes you a better either writer or filmmaker. But there's a difference between criticism and like a campaign to actually like take out a film where you're hiring lawyers and, threatening publications for their positive reviews with legal action and taking screenshots of credits and calling people up and intimidating them to try to take their name off the film. I mean, there's a difference between saying in a tweet, like, I watched this film and here are the problems I have with it, versus like my composer got like, I think 4 or 5 calls from people encouraging him to take his name off the film. And then when he asked every single one of them what the problem was, he found out that none of those people had actually seen the film. And so it's kind of, this whole thing like took on a life of its own. And I think it's, like I said before, I wish like we wouldn't be having this discussion, I don't think, if a Netflix had picked it up and people just go watch it for themselves, like I said before. And like once you watch the film, 99% of the things that we're being accused of are completely discredited. And I think, I don't like fault the people attacking the film, because throughout all of history, people will attack something that's public and popular and whatnot. And you're going to have people who like stuff and people who don't. But I think when you have institutions like Sundance and South by Southwest who capitulate to this kind of stuff and then kind of either apologize for the work or then choose not to show it after they invited the film, I think that to me is where things have shifted. Because, I think when Salman Rushdie got attacked this year, I kind of did a deep dive into that because I knew a little bit of it, but I didn't really know the details. And then reading about the translators who had been killed just by translating his book.
Yep.
And then bookstores who, fearing for their own safety, could have pulled the book, but they didn't. They chose to screen it anyway. And that was a principal thing. And now we're in a space where a prestigious film festival like Sundance, who is supposed to be a space for challenging films and for diverse thoughts and ideas and perspectives, is apologizing not once but twice because of a campaign on Twitter and a letter writing campaign. And I just feel that things have shifted in a way to where we used to have bookstores and publishers who would stick by their writers and stick by the work. And now that seems to not be the case. And that's really worrying for me. And I think that, I don't know, I'm not sure like where that transition happened. And I honestly wasn't aware of it because I was in my bubble for so long working on this film. But I'm hoping that that we don't go it's very worrying to me that we have people who haven't seen a film willing to pull it, or haven't even talked to the filmmaker and then accuse them of all this stuff, and who haven't seen the film. It's worrying.
So here's the irony, right? Because Sundance actually, in its letter about its comments of, after pulling your invite, said that they were going to send their staff members all for some kind of Islamophobia training, anti-Islamophobia training. And the reason why I think it's ironic is because if you do actually care about Islamophobia, the film you made, which is deeply humanistic, is and your actions, right? Somebody who sees 9/11 happen and decides to go to the region to understand those people. That is the cure for Islamophobia. It is precisely the cure. And the fact that you are being accused of it and not getting a chance to actually clear the air because the film is stuck now in this no man's land, is so ironic.
Yeah, I think unfortunately the thing that was so damning about Sundance's apology is they are a respected institution.
Yeah.
And for them apologizing not once but twice, it kind of reinforced the lies being told about the film. And that was very damaging, as well as Abigail Disney's apology. But I want to make something pretty clear here, because I know most people won't know this, but I differentiate between the Sundance Film Festival and Sundance, the Institute. I know that a lot of the people who programmed this film got a lot of hate. And they definitely, I don't think, wanted the the Institute to apologize, because it's basically like saying, you didn't do your job. You don't know what you're doing. And I know that like a lot of those people who were on the programming team had a lot of people reach out and accuse them of being racist and Islamophobic. And I don't know if you know this, but you don't get paid a lot of money to be a programmer. You do it out of love of the craft of filmmaking and documentary. And the fact that these people were being put through the ringer, and then their institution then apologized. I mean, I couldn't that must have been a horrible experience for them to kind of like have their institution not back them up either. So I don't want to like paint Sundance with a complete brush, because there are definitely people in there who really stood by the film. But unfortunately, the leadership at the time decided that that they were going to apologize. Again, not once, but twice for the film. And it was really, really hard to see that, because I have respected and looked up to Sundance for years. And it's every independent filmmaker's dream to have their film premiere there.
Meg, we always ask our guests the same last question. And it is, our goal here at FAIR is to provide pro-human alternatives to the issues of the day, like the very ones we're talking about right now. What does pro-human mean to you, and how can everyday people model that behavior?
Oh, that's a good question. Someone once watched the film and told me that the film was like if empathy was like a contact ultimate sport, right? Like if it was I think that for me, what I try to do is for example, I think it's always imperative to ask why before you kind of judge someone. So for example, initially when the film was announced and it was being attacked without anyone seeing it, my initial response was not anger, and it was not like I'm going to attack them back. It was, I actually understood it initially, because when someone who's not seen a film or met the person has that much rage against it, then there's something else going on there. And what do I mean by that was, I went on a call once as a firefighter, and this kid had really severely hurt his hand during the 4th of July. And we showed up on scene, and the mom was crying, but the father was irately angry. And that anger was directed at us. Like, we showed up on scene and he's like, "Where the fuck have you been? Like, what's taking you so long? You're so incompetent." And there was like so much rage that this person felt. And it was directed at the people who were trying to help his kid. And then we got the kid bandaged up and put him in the ambulance. And then right after they were out of earshot, one of the other firefighters said, like, "That guy's lucky I didn't deck him." And then our captain, who had a lot more experience than us, turned around and had this is about to be a teachable moment look on his face. He said, "Listen, trauma is very unpredictable. And you're meeting these people at the most traumatic moment of their lives. And different people deal with trauma differently. Some people cry, some people laugh, and some people get angry. And even though this man was angry at you, you have to realize that it wasn't about you. That this situation was really stressful, and this is how he was processing this trauma." And so initially, when the attack started, before anyone had seen the film, it felt like that. It's like there was so much rage against a film that I just thought, okay, this is a community for the last 20 years since 9/11 has had these experiences in the United States that have made them feel persecuted, that have made them feel otherized. And they see a film that's going to be at this prestigious film festival at Sundance. And they probably think, okay, this is another example of how our people are treated and how our people are portrayed. And so in the beginning, I thought this was just some kind of misunderstanding. And that when people saw the film, like, they would realize that, yeah, this if this was like every other terrorist film ever made, where it's fear mongering and reinforces stereotypes, then yeah, I would definitely understand that. But also, if it was Sundance, probably wouldn't have programmed it. So I think when someone is behaving in a way that might not make sense, I think the pro-human in me, instead of kind of hitting back, I think it's really good to try and put yourself in somebody else's shoes and just ask yourself why. Because there has to be a reason behind that. And I think, I consider her my sister, and she calls me her sister, and her family basically adopted me when I was in Yemen. But she lived in Iraq, and then we went to war in Iraq, and that country went to shit. And then she moved to Yemen with her family, and then that's where I met her like 20 years ago. And they kind of became my clan and adopted me over there and looked after me. And then when Yemen kind of imploded, then she moved to the States, and she lives here. And I remember when she moved here, she told me about her first, she'd been born in the States, but she grew up in Iraq. But her first time coming back to the States, she went through immigration and customs, and she took 3 steps out of the airport. And she wears a hijab, and someone spit in her face and told her to go back to where she came from. Now, this was her introduction to this country. And I think that over a period of time of people constantly being suspicious of you, constantly looking down on you, it takes its toll, and it is a kind of trauma. And so whenever you're dealing with people who maybe are coming at you in a way that you think is unjustified, before you kind of jump on and just think everyone's acting in bad faith, just try to put yourself in their shoes and realize that usually when someone's lashing out like that, it comes from a place of like pain, and it comes from a place of trauma. And like my captain said, trauma is very unpredictable. What people have to understand is there's a difference between the ethics of an activist and ethics of a journalist. Like if an activist, so for example, for Me Too, everyone was saying, believe all women. And that's an activist stance because we want to push this agenda. But as a journalist, if you find a story where someone is actually being untruthful, your job is to write that story, even though it's an inconvenient truth for the movement. And I think that if your movement is to paint all the men in Guantanamo as never having done anything at all wrong, then there were a lot of people in Guantanamo who that is true for, but that's not 100% for everyone there. Then this story kind of hurts that cause. But again, I'm not an activist. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and my ethics are, if it's true, even if it's inconvenient, I think it needs to be talked about. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a very beautiful, very gracious answer.
Not always gracious. I haven't had coffee yet, so I would have been a lot more gracious with some coffee.
Meg Smaker, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Fair Perspectives. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform, and leaving us a positive rating and review. You can also access exclusive podcast content, such as Q&As and bonus episodes, by visiting us and signing up at fairperspectives.org. For weekly fair news and opinion pieces by members of the fair community, visit our Substack at fairforall.substack.com, and tune into Fair News Weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to join or support the pro-human movement, visit us at fairforall.org/join us. Thanks again, and see you next time.